Where would you go in Glasgow to see if your arm is actually a foot? Why is this guy the centre of attention? And just who was George? Find out now in this episode of Astonishing Glasgow. In this episode, I'm going to the very centre of the city to introduce you to some of the residents of George Square. If you're Glaswegian, you certainly don't need me to tell you where George Square is, but for non-Glaswegians, this is the physical and civic centre of Glasgow, with the city chambers proudly standing over the east side of the square. The city chambers were opened in 1898 after the council offices moved here from the Trongate, but the square itself was laid out in 1781 and named after King George III. The square was once a private pleasure garden, surrounded by elegant mansions. Only 3 of those survive today, and they've been joined together to form the Millennium Hotel. The square's importance grew when the Edinburgh and Glasgow Railway demolished Glasgow House, the one-time mansion of James Ewing of Strathleven, to build their terminus in the city, which would eventually become the Queen Street station we know today. Across the road from the station, the Bank of Scotland took over the west side of the square and built their offices in 1865. That's the building the Counting House pub is now part of, hence the name and why it looks like the inside of a bank. And in 1878, the Prince of Wales laid the foundation stone for the main post office of Glasgow, right on the southeast corner. Eventually the city chambers were completed in 1898 and George Square's position as the centre of Glasgow was secured. So with the history of the square out the way, who are its residents? If you're from Glasgow, can you name more than 2 of the people immortalised in bronze on the square? Well, you'll be able to after this episode of Astonishing Glasgow. So let's get started with Dr. Thomas Graham. Born in 1805, Dr. Thomas Graham was an experimental scientist and a pioneering chemist, which is why he can be seen holding a book with a glass retort on the cover. He certainly seems to be in deep thought. Now, when Thomas died in 1869, he was buried next to Glasgow Cathedral, and this statue was gifted to the city by one of his former students, James Young. James Young didn't use his student loan to pay for the statue, as he'd probably still be paying it back now. He was an extremely wealthy man who, thanks to Thomas Graham's teachings, developed a way to extract paraffin wax and oil from oil shale. Thomas Graham's statue was unveiled on the square in 1872. Now we're going to go round the statues in a clockwise circle of the square. So onto a guy with a great surname, although I might just be biased. This is Thomas Campbell, born on the High Street in 1777, and as well as being a world champion at balancing pigeons and seagulls on his head, he was a poet, historian and political commentator. He started at university aged 7. After studying, he moved to Edinburgh for some reason, and began his literary career in 1799 with a poem called Pleasures of Hope. He died in 1844 and was buried in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey in London. This will not be the last time I'll say that in this video. The statue was erected here in 1877. As I move further around the square, we've moved from poets and scholars to military men. Standing side by side are Field Marshal Lord Clyde and Sir John Muir. Starting with the statue on the left, Sir John Muir, who was born in 1761 in the Trongate in Glasgow. His military career began in 1776, but he first saw action in 1778 in the American War of Independence. He went on to lead campaigns in the Irish Rebellion of 1798, the Napoleonic Wars between 1803 and 1808, and the Spanish War of 1808 to 1809. It was during the Spanish War and the Battle of Coruña that he was hit by a cannon shot on his left shoulder, breaking his arm and lacerating his whole left side and lungs. He only survived long enough to witness his victory, but succumbed to his wounds after several hours. He was wrapped in his military cloak and buried in the ramparts of Coruña. His statue was unveiled in Glasgow 10 years after his death, and it's made from 3 tons of cannon bronze salvaged from the Napoleonic Wars. Standing to John Moor's left is another Campbell. We just get everywhere. No relation as far as I know to me or Thomas Campbell, and Colin Campbell isn't even his real name. He was the eldest son of a John MacIver of Glasgow, a carpenter in the city, but when introduced to the Duke of York by his uncle on his mother's side, his mother's maiden name was used, and so he was therefore known as Colin Campbell. He was born in 1792 and began his military career aged 15. He fought in the Peninsular War under the command of Sir John Muir, who he stands right next to, but he became a leader in his own right, hence the statue. Fighting in America, Barbados and Gibraltar, he reached the rank of Major. His most famous battle was during the Crimean War, when his army repulsed Russian forces at the Battle of Balaclava in 1854. Unlike John Moore, Field Marshal Lord Clyde survived battle to collect his pension, and became a peer in 1858. He was also much liked by Queen Victoria. He died in 1863, and guess what? He was buried in Westminster Abbey. His statue was unveiled in 1868, but spent a lot of time in the design and planning stages. Some were wanting him to be shown on horseback, and some wanted no figure at all, but more controversially, many wanted his statue erected next to the Duke of Wellington's statue on Queen Street, and Sir John Muir's statue moved to the other side of the Duke, as they were all veterans of the Napoleonic War. In the end, his statue was unveiled on the square in 1868. Back to poets and authors with the next statue, and this guy really needs no introduction. Who hasn't heard of Robert Burns? Born in 1759, Robert Burns was Scotland's national poet and is worldwide famous to this very day. Who hasn't sung Auld Lang Syne at a party? His statue was unveiled in 1877, a full 81 years after his death, but to make sure it was ready to mark his birthday on the 25th of January that year, the bronze friezes on the pedestal were not yet installed. It was a major event when it was inaugurated by Lord Houghton. A crowd of around 30,000 people watched the ceremony and joined the procession to Glasgow Green. It really makes you wonder who would be popular enough now to have earned a statue on the square. Let me know in the comments who you would immortalise in bronze. We've reached the southwest corner and possibly my favourite person on the square. This is James Watt. Born in 1736, it's fair to say we owe a huge part of our modern lives to the work of the engineer James Watt. He has popped up in a couple of early episodes of Astonishing Glasgow. He has memorials on Glasgow Green, a plaque on the Trong Gate, and if you go to the Hunterian Museum, you will see the actual model of the Newcomen engine he was restoring when he had the idea for the high pressure steam engine. Without James Watt, the Industrial Revolution may never have happened. Steam-powered ships may not have been developed, railways may not have stretched across the country, and factories would not have had an easy and powerful source of energy. Every time you change a light bulb, it's got his name on it. So he really has cemented himself in history. He died in 1819 and is another member of the square who is buried in Westminster Abbey in London, but the only one I managed to find the grave of. His statue was unveiled in 1832, making this the second oldest statue on the square, with only John Moore being here 13 years longer. Just imagine how much has happened under these statues. Before I tell you about the George Square Grand National, a quick request for you to hit that like and subscribe button. And check out the brand new merch shop for stickers, shirts, caps and bags. All the details are below, and any purchases will help me make more episodes of Astonishing Glasgow. So go and treat yourself. You have my permission. So these two statues are a matching pair, just like the China Dugs in your granny's mantelpiece. But they were not made at the same time. On the left is Queen Victoria. This statue is by the sculptor Carlo Marochetti, the same sculptor as the Duke of Wellington statue on Queen Street. Right, let's get rid of that scaffolding at the front of the Goma. Right, that's better. It was while Victoria was in Glasgow in 1844 for the unveiling of this statue that she was overheard complimenting it. Eager to suck up to the Queen, the great and good of Glasgow immediately commissioned Marochetti to sculpt a statue of Victoria in the same style. Marochetti completed it in 1854, but it didn't arrive in the square until 1866. When it first arrived in Glasgow, it was assembled right here on St Vincent Place with a good view of the Apple Store. When her king consort Albert died in 1861, Victoria's statue galloped to the square to be next to his statue, also by Carlo Marochetti, and unveiled in 1866. Victoria's statue is the first statue in Britain depicting a woman on horseback, and has a sealed time capsule on the plinth containing newspapers and documents about the city of Glasgow as it was in 1853. Now, up till now, all the statues have been of scholars, soldiers and royalty, but that changes on the north side of the square as we enter the murky world of politics. This is Sir Robert Peel. Born in 1788, he started a political career in 1809 and was Home Secretary by 1822. In 1929, he was instrumental in forming the Metropolitan Police Force at Scotland Yard in London. The first 1,000 officers were commonly known as Bobbies, after Robert Peel, a nickname we still use for police officers today. He served as UK Prime Minister between 1834 and 1835, and then again between 1841 and 1846, and he died in 1850. His statue was erected here in 1859. We stick with Prime Ministers, and our next statue is of William Gladstone, who held the position 4 times. But it's not his ministerial robes he is seen wearing in this statue, however. This statue depicts him as the rector of Glasgow University, holding a book in his left hand and surrounded by scrolls and manuscripts. He died in 1898, and his statue was unveiled in 1902, but not here. He originally stood in front of the city chambers, but was moved to the north side of the square to make way for the Cenotaph in 1923. We will get to the Cenotaph after the next statue, but before we get to that, if you look on the ground in front of William Gladstone, you may wonder why you need to know it's 100 foot to the nearest bin. This is one of 3 sets of measuring standards to be found on George Square, to allow merchants, builders and surveyors to calibrate their own equipment. These gauges exist in most Victorian cities, and now you know this one is here, you will start to see them in other places, just like this one in Trafalgar Square in London. As well as a 100-foot gauge on the ground, as well as a chain gauge on the ground, there is this bronze gauge showing the length of a chain link, an inch, a foot and 2-foot standards fixed to the wall of the city chambers. It has been here since 1882 according to the text, but if you've been paying attention, you'll remember that the city chambers weren't complete until 1889. They didn't even start building them until 1883, and I can't find any evidence that this plaque was fixed to the previous city chambers on the Trongate. So let me know in the comments if you know how this was installed here before the wall existed. So back to the statues, and the last person we get to meet is James Oswald. Born in 1779, Oswald was the grand-nephew of the merchant and famous slave trader Richard Oswald. James Oswald wasn't involved directly in the slave trade, but he did inherit the family company of Oswald Stevenson and Co., and also the Oswald family estate in Kirkcudbright, so there is a legacy link to slavery. James Oswald became a politician in 1832 and was notable for being a supporter of the Reform Act, which made the Houses of Parliament more representative of voter numbers, as long as those voting were middle-class men, landowners and the rich. His Reform Act sadly left working-class men and women without a vote. His statue was originally erected near Charing Cross in 1856, but after a campaign by his family, the statue was moved here in 1875. It became a bit of a tradition for youngsters who referred to the statue as the man with a hat to try and throw small stones into the open end of his top hat. And that is the story of all of the statues. I don't think I've missed any. Oh, of course, the man in the middle of the square. It's easy to forget there's a statue on top of the plinth when you stand in the square. You get a much better view from Hanover Street. The top man is novelist and poet Sir Walter Scott. Born in 1771 in Edinburgh, although we won't hold that against him, he is of course now famous worldwide. He was a prolific author and poet, a contemporary of Robert Burns, and when he died in 1832, the plans for his statue were put in place only a few months later. Paid for by subscription, it is interesting that both Thomas Campbell and James Oswald, who also have statues in the square, made contributions to have this statue built. Unlike the other statues in the square, this one is made completely of Giffnock sandstone. See episode 12 of Astonishing Glasgow for more about that. He stands way up on top of the 80-foot column, holding a pen in his left hand and a book in his right. When unveiled in 1838, it was the first public monument to Sir Walter Scott anywhere in the world, so take that, Edinburgh. So we've mingled at the party and we've met all of the guests, but each of the statues in the square is only dedicated to one person. The last feature of the square is dedicated to the millions. The Cenotaph, or empty grave, was completed in 1924 as a memorial to Glaswegians killed during the Great War of 1914 to 1918. It was designed by John James Burnett, who also designed Charing Cross Mansions, the Savings Bank on Ingram Street and the Clyde Navigation Trust building. It is next to the Cenotaph that the annual Remembrance Service and Parade are held. The location for the Cenotaph was picked not only because this is the civic centre of Glasgow, but because it was from here that soldiers were recruited for the World War I campaigns. It was here that the soldiers marched to war, and it's here that they would return to remember those who were left on the battlefield. The inscription to those who fell during the Second World War was added in 1945, and the figure in the middle is that of St Mungo, Glasgow's patron saint. And if you look in the ground in front of the Cenotaph, you'll find a plaque remembering those who died in the atomic bomb attacks in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And either side, you can't ignore the lions. If you're about my age, do they remind you of the start of Ghostbusters as well? Just a thought. So this turned into a long episode, but I hope you found it interesting. And at the very least, now you know who you are looking at when you take a walk through the square or stop on a bench to eat your Greggs. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to hit that like and subscribe button. It really helps my channel grow. Hit the super thanks if you would like to make a donation to help me make more episodes of Astonishing Glasgow. And don't forget to check out the Astonishing Glasgow merchandise shop to treat yourself to a sticker, a mug, a t-shirt or a hat. Get in touch through the comments section or through the social media pages, all the links are below. And thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time. in Astonishing Glasgow. Right, I'm away for a rolling square sausage. See ya!